I never thought one moment of loneliness could lead to this. It was supposed to be a peaceful day at the beach with my son, Ethan. But as his hands lingered on my back, something shifted, something I couldn't ignore. I should have stopped it. I should have said no. But I didn't. And that decision changed everything forever. Ethan was my oldest son, 17 years old, tall, and carrying the quiet confidence of someone just stepping into adulthood. His dark hair and sharp features often reminded me of his father, David. But unlike David, Ethan was present. He noticed things. He listened. David and I had been married for 18 years. From the outside, we seemed like the perfect couple. A stable home, a comfortable life, and 2 kids who never gave us trouble. But appearances can be deceiving. David's career always came first. He worked long hours and often missed birthdays, anniversaries, and family vacations. I told myself it was temporary, that he was building a better future for us. But deep down, I knew better. I felt invisible in my own home. Conversations became about bills, schedules, and what needed fixing around the house. We stopped laughing. We stopped touching. Most nights, he fell asleep before I even got into bed. The loneliness was suffocating. I poured myself into being a good mother, trying to fill the void. Ethan noticed, though. He'd offer to help with chores, or sit beside me while I watched TV. Sometimes he'd ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" And I'd always lie, because what else could I do? That summer, David canceled yet another family trip, leaving me and Ethan to go to the beach alone. I told myself it would be good, some bonding time away from the house. But as we packed the car and set off, I couldn't shake the nagging sadness I felt. Ethan sat quietly in the passenger seat, headphones in, staring out the window. He didn't need to say anything for me to know he felt his father's absence too. When we arrived, the beach was nearly empty. The waves crashed gently, and the sun warmed my skin. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. I asked Ethan to help me apply sunscreen on my back, a simple request. He hesitated but agreed. What started as an innocent gesture soon became something else entirely. His touch lingered longer than it should have, and instead of pulling away, I froze. That moment, those few seconds of hesitation, set off a chain of events I never could have imagined. The days after that trip felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I kept replaying the moment Ethan's hands touched my skin, the way he hesitated but didn't stop. And worse, the way I let him continue. I tried to push the memory aside, to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the guilt lingered. Every time we locked eyes, I felt it. And so did he. Ethan started hovering closer than usual. He'd find excuses to help me around the house. Washing dishes, folding laundry, or fixing things his father ignored. I told myself he was just being thoughtful. After all, Ethan had always been a caring son. But then came the looks. I'd catch him watching me, longer than necessary, with an intensity one couldn't ignore. At first, I brushed it off as teenage awkwardness, but the way his eyes lingered made my skin prickle. One night, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I felt him behind me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought he might touch me again. Instead, he whispered, "Do you need help?" I nodded, unable to speak. His fingers brushed against mine as he took the dish towel from my hand. That small touch sent shivers through me, and I hated myself for it. I started noticing other things too. He began working out more, spending longer hours in his room. His shirt seemed to fit tighter, and I couldn't ignore how much he'd grown over the past year. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was becoming a man. And I wasn't the only one noticing. One afternoon, his friend Mason stopped by, and I overheard their conversation through the kitchen window. "You think your mom's hot," Mason teased. Ethan didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed nervously and changed the subject. I should have confronted him, should have put an end to whatever was happening between us. But I didn't. David's absence had left me hollow, and Ethan's attention filled that void. I told myself it was harmless, that he was just being sweet, that I was imagining things. But then came the second trip to the beach. It was hotter that weekend, and David had once again chosen work over family. I asked Ethan if he wanted to go back to the beach, thinking some fresh air might clear my head. This time, he didn't bring his headphones. Instead, he sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting and bouncing his leg as we drove. When we arrived, the beach was nearly empty again. The waves were calm, and the breeze carried the smell of salt and sunscreen. We laid out the towels, but something felt different. I didn't ask him to help with sunscreen this time. Instead, I tried to act normal, even as I felt his eyes on me the entire afternoon. And then came the showers. I told myself we were just rinsing off the sand, that there was nothing wrong with sharing a public shower. But as I stood under the water, letting it wash over me, I felt his gaze again, hot, heavy, and unmistakable. When I turned around, he didn't look away. He didn't even flinch. And that's when I knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. The moment under the beach shower haunted me for days. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself it meant nothing. But the way Ethan looked at me, that hunger in his eyes, was impossible to forget. Back home, things didn't return to normal. If anything, the tension between us grew thicker, almost unbearable. I began to notice the small changes in his behavior. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, brushing past me when there was plenty of room to walk. He'd sit closer to me on the couch during movie nights, his leg occasionally pressing against mine. I should have stopped it, drawn a firm line, but I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. One evening, I was folding laundry in my bedroom when Ethan knocked and stepped inside. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorframe and watched me. "Need something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just wanted to check if you're okay." His words were innocent enough, but the way he said them, softly, almost nervously, made my stomach twist. "I'm fine," I said, folding another shirt to avoid looking at him. But then he stepped closer. "Are you?" he asked. I froze. My hands trembled, and when I finally looked up, he was right there, too close. "Ethan," I whispered, but before I could say more, he reached out and touched my hand. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away, turning my back to him. "You should go," I said, my voice unsteady. He didn't move. Instead, I felt his presence behind me, the heat of his body radiating closer. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said softly. My breath caught in my throat. "I know it's wrong," he continued, "but I can't help it. I should have told him to leave, should have shut this down right then and there. But instead, I turned around, meeting his eyes. And in that moment, something inside me broke. I closed the distance between us, my hands trembling as I touched his face. "Neither can I admitted." The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. It was wrong, so wrong, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I kissed him back, pouring years of loneliness and longing into that single moment. When it ended, we both stood there, breathless and wide-eyed. "We can't," I started, but the words felt hollow. He reached for my hand again. "I don't want to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And neither did I. The next few days blurred together. We didn't talk about what had happened, but the tension between us only grew stronger. He'd brush against me as we passed in the hallway, his fingers lingering on mine when we handed each other dishes. Every glance felt heavy, filled with unspoken desire. One night, after David had fallen asleep, I found myself alone in the living room. Ethan appeared in the doorway, shirtless and nervous. "I couldn't sleep," he said. Neither could I. I didn't protest when he sat down beside me, and I didn't flinch when his hand rested lightly on my thigh. I should have pushed him away, but instead I leaned into him, letting his arm wrap around me. We didn't speak. There were no words left to say. And when his lips found mine again, I didn't stop him. The intensity of that night was unlike anything I'd felt in years. Urgent, forbidden, and completely out of control. Afterward, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on both of us. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Because when he looked at me with that same hunger in his eyes, I knew we were already too far gone to turn back. The days that followed were a blur, stolen glances, whispered conversations, and moments we knew we couldn't take back. Every touch left me breathless, every kiss pushing us further down a path we both knew was wrong. But it wasn't just the guilt that weighed on me. It was the fear of getting caught, fear of what would happen if David found out, and fear of what we had become. One evening, after another late night at work, David came home earlier than expected. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, and Ethan was helping me dry them, just like before. Only this time, when David walked in, he froze. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. Ethan dropped the dish he was holding, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the kitchen. "Nothing," I said quickly, wiping my hands on a towel. "He was just helping me." But David's eyes narrowed. "Helping you?" He stepped closer, his gaze shifting between me and Ethan. I felt the tension crackle in the air, and for the first time, I saw suspicion in David's eyes. "Why are you so nervous?" he asked Ethan. Ethan stammered. I wasn't. It just slipped." David didn't buy it. "Go to your room," he said to Ethan, his voice low and firm. Ethan hesitated, but I nodded, silently telling him to leave. Once we were alone, David turned to me. "What's going on, Freya?" "Nothing," I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "You're overreacting." He shook his head. "No, I'm not. I've seen the way he looks at you. And I've seen the way you look at him." My heart pounded in my chest. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he snapped. "Because I've been imagining a lot lately, like how distant you've been, how secretive. And now this." I tried to brush past him, but he grabbed my arm, stopping me. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. The words were right there, but I couldn't say them. Instead, I yanked my arm free and walked out of the kitchen. That night, David barely spoke to me. He slept on the couch, and I stayed in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The next morning, Ethan avoided me. He wouldn't even look in my direction. And that's when I knew it wasn't just David who sensed something was wrong. Ethan was starting to regret it too. But the damage was already done. Later that week, I overheard David talking to someone on the phone. He mentioned hiring a private investigator. My stomach dropped. I had to end it. I waited until we were alone, just Ethan and me. He was in his room, headphones on, staring blankly at his computer screen. I sat down beside him, and when he looked at me, I saw the pain in his eyes. "We can't do this anymore," I said softly. He didn't say anything, just nodded. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "I should have stopped it before it started." "But you didn't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And neither did I." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I'll fix this," I promised. "I'll make it right." But we both knew there was no fixing it. Later that night, David confronted me again. Only this time, he didn't just ask questions. He demanded answers. And I gave them to him. I confessed everything, every touch, every kiss, every moment I let things go too far. The look in his eyes will haunt me forever. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just stood there, silent and broken. "I trusted you," he finally said, his voice hollow. I tried to explain, to tell him how lonely I'd been, how invisible I'd felt. But he didn't want to hear it. By the next morning, he was gone, taking our daughter with him. Ethan stayed. But nothing was the same. We avoided each other, both too ashamed to face what we had done. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized I had lost everything. My husband, my family, and the life I had spent years building. But the worst part? I wasn't sure I regretted it. Because every time I looked at Ethan, I felt that pull again, that forbidden need that refused to go away. And that terrified me more than anything. The house felt hollow after David left. His absence echoed in every corner, and the silence was unbearable. My daughter, Emma, didn't understand what was happening. She kept asking when her dad was coming back, and each time, I forced a smile and said, "Soon." But deep down, I knew he wasn't coming back. Ethan tried to be strong for me. He stayed close, helping with chores and trying to make me laugh. But no matter how hard he tried, the tension between us lingered, thick, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the empty side of the bed where David used to sleep. My thoughts would drift to Ethan, to the way he looked at me, the way he touched me. And the guilt would hit me all over again. I told myself it had to end. We had to stop before it destroyed us completely. But then, one evening, I walked past his room and saw his door slightly open. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. I knocked softly. "Ethan!" He looked up, and the pain in his eyes shattered me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "You don't have to be sorry." "Yes, I do," he said. "I ruined everything." "No," I said, sitting beside him. "I did." We sat in silence, the weight of our mistakes pressing down on us. And then he reached for my hand. I should have pulled away, should have told him we couldn't do this anymore. But instead, I let him hold it. "I can't lose you too," he said. His words broke me. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly as he trembled against me. "You won't," I promised. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The following days were a blur. I threw myself into routines, cleaning, cooking, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. Ethan became more distant, barely speaking to me unless it was necessary. I caught him staring at me sometimes, but the warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by something colder. One afternoon, I found him packing a bag. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I need space," he said. "I can't stay here." My heart dropped. "Ethan, please don't do this." But he didn't look at me. "I have to." And just like that, he was gone. The emptiness that followed was unbearable. I wandered through the house, surrounded by memories I couldn't escape. The guilt consumed me, but so did the loneliness. I tried calling him, once, twice, a dozen times, but he never answered. David refused to speak to me. Through lawyers, he made it clear that he wanted full custody of Emma. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. I'd destroyed everything. Weeks turned into months, and the silence became my companion. I stopped leaving the house. I stopped answering calls. I let the world fade away, convinced I didn't deserve to be part of it anymore. But late at night, when the house was dark and still, I'd think about Ethan. I'd wonder where he was, if he hated me, if he missed me as much as I missed him. And then one night the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me to pick up. "Mom!" It was Ethan. His voice was shaky, and I could tell he'd been crying. "I'm sorry," he said. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the phone. "I'm sorry too." We didn't talk for long, but hearing his voice brought me a strange sense of comfort, like maybe, just maybe, we could fix this. But deep down, I knew that no matter how much we wanted to, some things couldn't be undone. The damage was too great, the lines we'd crossed too deep. And as I hung up the phone that night, I realized that the consequences of our actions would haunt us forever. The days following Ethan's phone call felt like waking up from a bad dream. Only the nightmare didn't end when I opened my eyes. Everything we'd done lingered in the air, impossible to erase. I spent hours replaying our conversations, our actions, and every moment where I should have said no but didn't. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the emptiness. David officially filed for divorce. He didn't want explanations or apologies, just distance. And I couldn't blame him. I had shattered the life we built, leaving nothing but fragments. Emma stayed with him, and though I visited her occasionally, I could feel her confusion, her questions unspoken, but heavy in her eyes. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell her that loneliness can twist a person into someone they don't recognize. But how could I expect her to understand when I didn't understand it myself? And then there was Ethan. After our phone call, he didn't reach out again. Weeks passed without a word. I didn't know where he was or what he was doing, and the not knowing gnawed at me. I wanted to believe he was okay, that he'd moved on, found clarity, and started to rebuild. But a part of me feared the opposite, that he was as broken as I was, trapped in the aftermath of what we'd done. I started therapy, hoping to untangle the mess inside my head. My therapist told me I was looking for validation, for attention and affection I wasn't getting from my husband. She said I let my emotional needs overpower my moral boundaries. And she was right, but knowing the reason didn't make it easier to live with what I'd done. I learned to stop checking my phone, waiting for Ethan's name to appear. I forced myself to go outside, to reconnect with old friends who had no idea what had happened. I smiled in their presence, pretending I was okay, even when the guilt felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Months passed, and one day, out of nowhere, Ethan showed up at my door. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes still held that same intensity, the one that had drawn me in and destroyed everything. "I needed to see you," he said. My heart raced, but I stayed calm. "Ethan, we can't." "I know," he interrupted. "I just needed to see you." We sat in the living room, awkward and unsure, the weight of our mistakes hanging between us. "I'm trying to move on," he said, his voice quiet. "But it's hard." I nodded. "I know." For the first time, I saw the pain in his eyes, not desire, not longing, but regret. And it broke me all over again. "We have to let this go," I said softly. He didn't respond at first, but finally he nodded. "I'm sorry, Mom." "I'm sorry too." And with that, he left. I stood at the window watching him walk away, knowing it was the right thing but hating how much it hurt. Since that day, I've been trying to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. I've learned that loneliness can make people desperate, reckless, and blind to consequences. I let my emptiness control me, and it led to a betrayal I can never undo. But I also learned that healing doesn't happen overnight. It's messy, painful, and slow. I may never fully forgive myself, but I'm trying. And if there's one thing I hope people take from my story, it's this: don't let your loneliness define you. Don't let your need for attention push you to cross lines you can't uncross. Because no moment of validation is worth losing the people you love, or losing yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it wasn't easy to hear, but sometimes the hardest stories are the ones we need to tell. If you've ever felt lost, lonely, or desperate for connection, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories like this one.